The summer of 1882 had turned the Llano Estacado into a furnace of dust and despair. The wind carried more grit than hope across the scorched grasslands, where purple cactus flowers drooped like forgotten prayers. Evelyn Hart stood beside the failing well, her hands cracked and raw from alkaline water and endless toil. At 26, widowhood had aged her beyond her years, carving lines of determination around eyes that had once sparkled with dreams. The small ranch sprawled before her like a dying thing, the cattle shed listed to one side, its warped boards groaning in the heat. Fence posts leaned drunkenly, their bases eaten away by wind and time. 17 longhorns, ribs showing through their dusty hides, clustered in whatever shade they could find, near a gnarled mesquite tree. The broken wagon lay on its side, one wheel missing. The axle snapped clean through. Evie unfolded the letter that had arrived that morning, though she'd already memorized its contents. Lyle Caro's precise handwriting spelled out her doom: 3 weeks to pay the outstanding debt or face foreclosure. The general store had already refused her credit, and whispers followed her through town like tumbleweeds. Poor thing, they'd say, not quite quietly enough. A woman alone can't manage land like that. She'd buried Thomas in the canyon 2 winters past, after a storm-weakened cottonwood had crushed him while checking fence lines. No children to carry on his name, no family to lean on, just this parched piece of earth and juniper. The bay mare who nickered softly from the corral. The land was all she had left of their dreams, dreams that now tasted of dust and bitter disappointment. The drought had stretched 90 days without relief. Spider web cracks ran through the earth like accusations, and the wind scraped across the land with sandpaper persistence. Each night, coyotes howled from the distant mesas, their voices carrying promises of death for any stock too weak to defend itself. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Caleb Whitlock rode across the grassland. His clothes bore the dust of a long day moving cattle, the leather of his saddle worn smooth from countless hours under the Texas sun. He'd been heading back to his father's sprawling Triple W ranch when he spotted the broken wagon. The woman stood with her back to him, studying the damage with shoulders set in a line of stubborn refusal to surrender. He'd seen that stance before, on men about to draw in a hopeless fight, on mothers protecting children from prairie storms. He pulled up his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, looks like you could use a hand with that axle." Evie turned, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle propped against the wagon bed. When she saw who it was, her jaw tightened. Everyone knew the Whitlock name. Ephraim Whitlock owned the largest spread in 3 counties and had a reputation for getting what he wanted, one way or another. "I manage fine on my own," she said, though they both could see the lie in the broken wagon and the exhaustion etched on her face. "No doubt you do," Caleb replied, dismounting slowly, keeping his hands visible. "But iron don't bend to pride, and that axle needs fixing before nightfall. I've got tools in my saddlebags." They studied each other across the space of dust and wariness. Caleb saw a woman who wore her widowhood like armor. Black dress faded to gray, golden hair pulled back severe enough to pain. Evie saw a man who moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never wanted for anything, though his eyes held something she hadn't expected: respect, maybe, or at least the absence of pity. "I can't pay you," she said finally. "Didn't ask for pay." He was already pulling tools from his pack, just being neighborly. She watched him work, noting the competent way he handled the repairs. No wasted motion, no showing off. When the wind picked up, threatening to tear loose a section of the shed roof, he climbed up without being asked and hammered it back into place. As darkness approached, she found herself setting out a simple meal: beans and cornbread. Nothing fancy, but hot and filling. They ate in careful silence, the space between them measured and proper. Caleb asked no questions about her husband or her circumstances. Evie offered no explanations. When he finished, he gathered his tools and prepared to leave. "Thank you," she said, the words stiff as new leather. He touched his hat again. You need anything else fixed? I'll be moving cattle through the south pasture tomorrow. Could check that fence line if you'd like. I manage fine, she began, then stopped. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, not with the bank letter burning a hole in her pocket. The windmill needs adjusting. If you have time. News traveled fast in a small community. By noon the next day, Reverend Elkins had managed to spot Caleb leaving the Hart Ranch at dawn, and tongues began wagging with the enthusiasm of people who had little entertainment beyond other folks' business. The image of young widow Hart in her faded black dress became the subject of conversations in the mercantile, the church, and every front porch in between. Evie felt the weight of their stares when she rode into town for supplies. The whispers followed her like dust devils, swirling with speculation and judgment. The Whitlock boy, they murmured. What's he doing spending time out there? Some eyes held sympathy, others suspicion, but all watched her with the intense interest of those who fed on others' misfortunes. That evening, alone in her small kitchen, Evie allowed herself a moment of bitter reflection. The walls seemed to press closer each day, and the silence rang louder than any accusation. She'd felt anger at first at Thomas for dying, at God for allowing it, at the land for demanding so much. Now she felt only a bone-deep weariness that threatened to pull her under. But beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred. For the first time in 2 years, someone had looked at her and seen a person, not a tragedy. Caleb Whitlock hadn't offered charity or condescension. He'd simply fixed what was broken and moved on. The thought brought an unfamiliar lightness to her chest, quickly suppressed. She couldn't afford hope any more than she could afford new fence posts. Still, when morning came and she heard hoofbeats approaching, she found herself checking her reflection in the small mirror by the door, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear before stepping out to meet the day, and perhaps whatever else it might bring. The drought deepened its grip on the land like a fist slowly closing. The well dropped another foot, and Evie spent her mornings hauling up buckets that yielded more mud than water. She stood at the edge of her property, squinting toward Clear Hollow, the creek that ran 2 days' cattle drive away through treacherous canyon country. The thought of moving 17 head of weakened longhorns across sliding rock and narrow passes made her stomach clench. But dying of thirst wasn't an option either. Caleb returned as promised, this time with a bedroll and a proposition. I owe you for the meal, he said, gesturing toward the broken windmill. Let me work it off. Fix what needs fixing. All I need is a spot in the hay barn to sleep. Evie's first instinct was refusal. Having a man around the place would only fuel more gossip. But the windmill blades hung crooked, the barn door sagged, and a dozen other repairs called out for hands stronger than hers. Pride had its limits when survival hung in the balance. 3 days, she said finally. Fair wage for fair work, nothing more. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of labor and careful distance. They worked side by side under the merciless sun driving nails, splitting wood, stretching wire. The work was hard and honest resin-scented pine boards, rope burns, sweat that stung the eyes. Words were scarce as water, but understanding grew in small gestures, a nod of approval here, a steadying hand there when a board proved unwieldy. Evie found herself stealing glances at this man who worked without complaint. Caleb moved with the easy efficiency of someone raised to ranch work. But there was something else too, a gentleness in how he handled her few possessions, a respect for boundaries both spoken and unspoken. She saw how he favored his left shoulder sometimes, an old injury perhaps, and how his eyes went distant when the evening shadows grew long. For his part, Caleb discovered layers beneath Evie's stern exterior. He watched her gentle juniper with soft words and patient hands, saw the care she took rationing feed to make it stretch. Her pride wasn't mere stubbornness. It was the backbone that kept her upright when everything else tried to bend her low. In the evenings, when exhaustion should have claimed her, she still checked every animal, every gate, every detail that meant the difference between hanging on and giving up. The peace shattered on the fourth day. Vince Cutter rode up with 3 of Ephraim Whitlock's hands, their horses raising dust clouds like harbingers. Cutter, a man with a face carved from cruelty and eyes like chips of flint, didn't bother dismounting. Afternoon. Widow Hart, he drawled, the title dripping with false courtesy. Heard you've been having some water troubles. Mr. Whitlock wanted me to remind you that the Triple W would be happy to help out. For the right considerations. My water rights are clear, Evie replied, standing straight despite the fear crawling up her spine. Filed proper and legal. Cutter's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Legal's one thing, practical's another. Awful lot can happen to a woman alone out here. Stock wandering off, fences breaking, wells going bad. He let the implications hang in the air like smoke. Caleb stepped out from the barn, hammer still in hand. The men's expressions shifted, surprise flickering across their faces before settling into something harder. Boys, Caleb said quietly. Something you need. Just paying a neighborly visit. Cutter replied, but his hand had moved closer to his sidearm. Didn't expect to find you here. Caleb, your daddy know where you're spending your time. I expect he knows I'm working for fair wages. Caleb answered, Now, if you've delivered your message, Mrs. Hart has stock to tend. The moment stretched taut as wire. Finally. Cutter touched his hat with mocking politeness. We'll be seeing you. Widow Hart. You too, Caleb. Your daddy's going to be real interested to hear about this. They rode off, but their dust lingered like a threat. That evening at the Triple W, Ephraim Whitlock stood behind his massive oak desk like a judge pronouncing sentence. At 60, he remained an imposing figure, gray-bearded, broad-shouldered, with eyes that had seen the territory transform from Comanche hunting grounds to cattle empire. Those eyes now fixed on his son with disappointment sharp as a blade. You're going soft over a widow, he said, voice low and dangerous. Have you forgotten what we're building here, that Hart property controls access to Clear Hollow? Without it, our southern range is worthless come drought time. She's not selling, Caleb replied, meeting his father's gaze steadily. And she shouldn't have to. Shouldn't? Ephraim laughed, a sound like gravel grinding. Boy, should and shouldn't don't mean spit out here. There's those who survive and those who don't. Which do you plan to be? For the first time in his life, Caleb felt the weight of his father's expectations like chains around his chest. He'd always gone along, always chosen the easy path of obedience. But something had shifted in those days working beside Evie Hart, seeing her refuse to break, refuse to bend, refuse to become another casualty of the harsh land and harsher men. I plan to be someone who can look at himself in the mirror, Caleb said quietly, and walked out before his father could respond. The wind picked up that night, rattling the loose boards and sending the windmill blades into a shrieking spin. Evie lay awake, listening to the sounds of her fragile world trying to tear itself apart. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb moving in the barn, probably securing equipment against the coming storm. The thought of him out there standing between her and whatever darkness might come calling brought an unexpected comfort. Morning came gray with dust. Over bitter coffee, they made their decision. The cattle won't last another week without water, Evie said, staring into her cup. Clear Hollow's the only option. It's a hard drive, Caleb warned. 2 days if we're lucky, 3 if we're not, and that's if the weather holds. Then we'd better get lucky. She looked up, meeting his eyes. I go with the herd. They're all I have left. He didn't argue. He'd learned that much about her when Evelyn Hart set her mind. Mountains had better start moving. They set out at dawn, driving the cattle into the rising sun. The journey to Clear Hollow tested every skill they possessed. The land fought them with loose shale that sent cattle sliding, thorny brush that tore at hide and cloth alike, and narrow passages where one wrong step meant disaster. Evie had taken a bad fall, her ankle twisting on loose rock. But before she could fully register the pain, Caleb's hand was there, steady and sure, pulling her up. He held on just long enough to ensure she was stable, then let go, respecting the boundaries that still stood between them like fence posts. When they finally crested the last rise and saw clear hollows spread below water running clear as glass, cottonwoods providing blessed shade, the cattle broke into a stumbling run. Evie felt laughter bubble up from some deep place she'd thought dried out, watching the animals wade in with bellowing relief. "We made it," she breathed, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt something like hope. Caleb built a small fire as darkness fell. They sat on opposite sides, sharing coffee in silence, listening to the night sounds, frogs singing, water gurgling over stones, the contented lowing of cattle finally able to drink their fill. "My father wasn't always hard," Caleb said suddenly, surprising them both. "He came here with nothing but determination, built the Triple W from scratch, fought drought and Indians and rustlers. Somewhere along the way, I think he forgot there's more than one way to be strong." Evie listened without judgment, understanding the weight of living up to or down to someone else's expectations. When he fell silent, she offered her own truth. "I was 15 when I learned to ride properly. My father said a woman who couldn't sit a horse in this country might as well dig her own grave. He was right, though I hated him for it then." She smiled sadly. "Funny how the hard lessons are the ones that save us." They were still talking, guards slowly dropping, when the gunshots cracked across the water. The bullets whined overhead, sending chips of rock flying from the canyon wall. Vince Cutter's gang had chosen their ambush well high ground. Good cover. The cattle trapped between the creek and steep slopes. Caleb rolled behind a fallen cottonwood, drawing his Colt as another shot gouged bark inches from his head. "Stay down," he shouted to Evie. But she was already flat against the earth, one hand gripping the lead rope to keep the cattle from scattering. Her other hand held her rifle steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The animals milled nervously, their eyes rolling white with terror. "That's far enough." "Whitlock," Cutter's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "This here's a private conversation with the widow. No need for you to die over another man's woman." Caleb fired twice, forcing the attackers to duck. "Seems like you boys are doing all the talking with lead. That's no way to hold a conversation." The firefight was brief but vicious. Caleb's shots were careful, calculated, meant to warn, not kill. When one of Cutter's men tried to flank them, Evie swung her rifle and fired, the bullet kicking up dust at his feet. The man scrambled back, cursing. "Next one won't miss," she called out, her voice steady despite her racing heart. After 10 minutes, that felt like hours. Cutter apparently decided the game wasn't worth the risk. "This ain't over. Widow, you can't hide behind the Whitlock name forever." The riders disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving only settling dust and the echo of hoofbeats. Caleb kept watch while Evie checked the cattle, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. Not one animal lost, though a few bore scratches from their panicked movements. "They weren't trying to kill us," Caleb said quietly. "Just scare us, make a point." "Well, they made it clear enough." Evie sank down beside the fire, exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. "Water. It always comes down to water out here." Dawn came gray and subdued. They drove the cattle back in silence, both lost in thought about what the attack meant for the future. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every distant rider might bring trouble. The journey that had taken 2.5 days out stretched to 3 on the return, caution making them choose longer but safer routes. When they finally saw the ranch buildings in the distance, Evie's heart sank. Fresh boot prints circled the barn. The henhouse door hung open, and she could already count the missing chickens. But it was the deliberate damage that stung most. Someone had taken an axe to the new repairs, leaving splintered wood and bent nails as a clear message. One of the young calves was gone too, vanished without a trace. Evie walked the perimeter, checking every possible hiding spot, but they both knew it was useless. The calf had been taken, not lost. She stood in the ruins of their work, jaw clenched tight against the scream building in her chest. "They want me to break," she said, voice hard as flint. "Want me to run crying to town? Sell out cheap, disappear like a good little woman should." "Evie," Caleb started, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. Don't tell me it'll be all right. Don't promise things you can't deliver." She grabbed a hammer and began pulling the damaged boards free. "If they want to fight, they'll get one. Board by board, nail by nail. I'll rebuild it all 100 times if I have to." The next morning brought a different kind of assault. A delegation from town arrived in their Sunday best, despite it being Thursday. Reverend Elkins, with his perpetually worried expression, Mrs. Byrne the seamstress, whose tongue was sharper than her needles, and Lyle Carrow from the bank, wearing his authority like an ill-fitting suit. "Mrs. Hart," the Reverend began, hat in hand but judgment in his eyes. "We've come out of Christian concern for your situation." "My situation." Evie didn't invite them in, meeting them on the porch with arms crossed. "Mrs." Byrne took over, her voice dripping false sympathy. "Dear, you must know how it looks. A young widow, a single man staying here. People are talking." "People are always talking," Evie replied. "Funny how they never talk about the men who shoot at folks in the dark or steal cattle in broad daylight." Carrow cleared his throat. "Be that as it may, there are standards to maintain. The bank has certain expectations of its debtors regarding moral character." The threat was subtle but clear. "Pay your debts or we'll use any excuse to call them in early." Evie felt Caleb tense beside her, but before she could respond, he stepped forward. "If you're concerned about propriety," he said calmly, "you should know I'm employed here as a ranch hand. I sleep in the barn, take my wages in room and board, and conduct myself with complete respect for Mrs. Hart. If anyone suggests otherwise, I'd be happy to discuss it with them directly." The delegation exchanged glances. A Whitlock defending the widow complicated their neat moral narrative. "Young man," Reverend Elkins tried again, "surely you must see how your presence here reflects on both your families." "What I see," Caleb interrupted, "is a woman trying to hold on to her land through honest work, and neighbors more interested in gossip than gospel. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have stock to tend." After they left, trailing dust and indignation, Evie found herself trembling, not from fear or anger, but from something else, the shock of having someone stand beside her, speak for her without speaking over her. That evening, she set 2 plates on the table without comment. It was a small gesture, but it shifted something fundamental between them. They ate in companionable silence, the kitchen lamp casting a warm circle of light against the darkness pressing at the windows. "They'll make it harder now," she said finally. "Your father, the town, all of them." "Let them try." Caleb met her eyes across the table. "I've spent my whole life doing what was expected. Maybe it's time I did what was right." The wind changed direction that night, carrying the smell of smoke. They rushed outside to find the corner of the hay storage ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the dry wood. Working together with a desperate efficiency, they formed a bucket brigade of 2, Evie pumping water while Caleb threw it on the flames. Wet blankets smothered the smaller spots, and by dawn they'd saved most of the structure, though one corner stood blackened and skeletal against the lightening sky. Caleb's hands were blistered from the hot bucket handles, and Evie insisted on tending them, as she wrapped the burns with strips torn from a clean petticoat. Neither spoke about the intimacy of the moment, her fingers gentle on his damaged skin, his breathing careful and controlled. "They're not going to stop," she said quietly, tying off the last bandage. "No," he agreed. "They're not." She looked up at him then, really looked, and saw not the rancher's privileged son, but a man who'd chosen to stand with her against his own interests. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you really here?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "First time I saw you, you were standing in that broker's office in town. Must have been 3 years ago. You were negotiating for seed, and Hendricks was trying to charge you double what he'd charge a man. You didn't yell or plead. You just laid out the facts, cold and clear, until he had no choice but to deal fair." He smiled slightly. "I thought then you were the strongest person I'd ever seen. Still do." Evie felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. She turned away, busying herself with putting away the medical supplies. "Strength's just another word for having no choice but to keep going." "No," Caleb said softly. "It's not." They stood there in the smoky dawn, the ruined corner of the barn a testament to the fight ahead. But something had shifted in the night, not just between them, but within them. They were no longer two people brought together by circumstance. They were choosing to stand together. Come what may. "We need to get to town," Evie said finally. "File a complaint with the sheriff about the shooting and the theft." "Sheriff Harmon's a good man," Caleb agreed. "But he's only one man, and my father has a lot of influence." "Then we'd better make sure we have the law clearly on our side." Evie's chin lifted with determination. "Starting with documenting every boundary marker on this property. If they want to fight dirty, we need to be smarter." As the sun climbed higher, burning off the smoke and morning mist, they prepared for the battles ahead. The easy days were over, if there had ever been easy days in this hard country. But standing together in the ruins of the night's violence, they found something worth more than ease, the beginning of a partnership forged in fire and tested by adversity. "Together, then?" Caleb asked, extending his bandaged hand. Evie took it without hesitation. Together. The summons came at dawn, delivered by one of Ephraim Whitlock's men who wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes. The message was brief: appear at the W immediately, or consider himself no longer a son of the house. Caleb read it twice, then tucked it into his shirt pocket with steady hands. "You should go," Evie said quietly, watching from the doorway. "He's still your father." "That he is." Caleb checked his gun, a gesture born more of habit than real expectation of violence. "But I'm not the son he thinks he raised anymore." The ride to the W took an hour, each familiar landmark a reminder of the life he was choosing to leave behind. The big house rose from the prairie like a monument to will and ambition, its windows reflecting the morning sun like accusing eyes. Ephraim waited in his study, the room that had witnessed every important decision in Caleb's life. "Sit," his father commanded, but Caleb remained standing. Ephraim studied his son with eyes cold as winter steel. "You've embarrassed me. More than that. You've betrayed everything this family has built. For what, a widow who'll lose that land anyway?" "For doing what's right," Caleb replied evenly. "Something you taught me, once upon a time." "Right," Ephraim laughed bitterly. "Boy, right is what puts food on tables and roofs over heads. That Hart woman is sitting on water we need. The whole southern range depends on access to Clear Hollow." "Then buy it fair. Make an honest offer." "I did. Her fool husband turned it down, and now she's following his stubborn path straight to ruin." Ephraim leaned back in his chair. "But I'm going to make this simple. Cut ties with her now. Come back where you belong, and I'll make sure she gets a fair price for the land. Enough to start over somewhere else. Comfortable like." "And if I don't?" The older man's face hardened. "Then you're no son of mine. You'll get nothing, no inheritance, no protection, no name. You'll be just another hired hand scraping by on pride and poor decisions." Caleb felt the words hit like physical blows, but he'd expected them. "If that's what it costs to look myself in the mirror, so be it." He turned to leave, but his father's voice stopped him at the door. "She's bewitched you, boy. When this ends badly, and it will don't come crawling back." Caleb left without another word, but the ride back to Evie's ranch felt longer than the journey out. He'd just cut himself off from everything he'd ever known, everything he'd been raised to expect. Yet, as the small buildings came into view, smoke rising from the chimney in a welcoming spiral, he felt lighter than he had in years. Evie was checking fence posts when Vince Cutter found her alone. Caleb had gone to check the far pasture, and she'd thought nothing of working by herself until she heard the approaching hoofbeats. Cutter swung down from his horse with the lazy confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. "Widow heart," he drawled, keeping his hand casual near his gun. "Thought we should have a private talk, just you and me." "Nothing you have to say interests me." She kept working, though every nerve screamed danger. "Oh, I think it might." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey and tobacco on him. "See, your boy Caleb ain't here to play hero. His daddy's cut him off, which means you've got no protection anymore. But I could be real friendly to a woman who was smart enough to be friendly back." The implications in his voice made her skin crawl. She gripped the fence tool tighter, calculating distances and options. "Get off my land." "Now, is that any way to talk to someone offering help?" He reached out as if to touch her face. The crack of knuckles against jaw was loud in the morning air. Cutter stumbled back, blood streaming from his nose, to find Caleb standing between him and Evie. "Touch her again and I'll kill you," Caleb said quietly. And something in his voice made it clear this wasn't a threat, but a simple statement of fact. Cutter wiped blood from his face, eyes blazing. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, boy. Both of you." He mounted his horse with wounded dignity. "This ain't over, not by a long shot." After he rode off, Evie realized she was shaking. "How did you—" "Saw him heading this way, cut across the creek." Caleb flexed his hand, knuckles already swelling. "You all right?" "Yes." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Your father made his position clear. I made mine clearer." He looked at her then. Really looked at her. "I'm just a hired hand now, Evie. No name to protect you, no influence to wield. If you want me to leave—" "Don't!" The word came out sharper than she intended. "Don't you dare leave now!" That night, the dust storm hit with a vengeance. The sky turned yellow as sulfur, and the wind howled like all the demons of hell had been loosed on the plains. They worked frantically to secure everything they could, tools, equipment, anything that might blow away. The animals huddled together, eyes white with fear. Inside the house, the walls groaned and shutters banged despite being latched tight. Dust seeped through every crack, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. They sat at the kitchen table, bandanas tied over their faces, listening to the world try to tear itself apart outside. "Had a storm like this the year Thomas and I were married," Evie said, voice muffled by the cloth. "Thought it was the end of the world. He just held my hand and said, 'If it is, at least we're together.' I thought he was being romantic. Now I think he was just being practical." Caleb reached across the table, and, after a moment's hesitation, she took his hand. They sat like that while the storm raged, drawing comfort from simple human connection in the face of nature's fury. Dawn revealed the devastation. 2 cattle dead, suffocated by dust, the chicken coop demolished, birds scattered to the winds, fence posts down for a quarter-mile. Evie stood surveying the damage, and for the first time since Thomas died. Caleb saw her shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. "We'll fix it all." "With what?" She turned on him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've got 3 weeks to pay the bank. I've lost stock, lost feed, lost time. They win. Caleb, your father, Cutter, all of them. They win because they can afford to wait while I'm bled dry by acts of God and acts of men." He pulled her against him then, and she let him, crying into his shirt while he held her. When the storm of tears passed, she pulled back, embarrassed by the show of weakness. "I'm sorry, "Don't apologize for being human," he said gently. "Even the strongest people need to break sometimes." That afternoon, Caleb rode back to the Triple W while Evie salvaged what she could from the storm damage. He went not to the main house, but to the breeding barn, where the prize bull his father had bought last spring was kept. It was a magnificent animal, worth more than most men saw in a lifetime. Caleb studied it for a long moment, then made his decision. "I need to borrow Samson," he told the startled hand on duty. "Personal business." "But Mr. Whitlock said." "I'm still a Whitlock until he puts it in writing," Caleb said firmly. "Samson's partly mine by rights. I'll have him back in a week." He led the bull back to Evie's ranch, where she stood speechless at the sight. "Caleb! No, you can't." "Already done. Your cows need breeding to be worth anything at market. This fellow can service the whole herd in a few days, and the calves will bring triple price come spring." He avoided her eyes. "Call it an investment in the future. Your father will." "My father's already done his worst. Let me do this, Evie. Let me help the only way I can now." That evening, as they watched the valuable bull get acquainted with the cows, Evie said quietly, "I've been a fool." "How's that?" "Thinking I had to do everything alone. Thinking accepting help meant being weak." She looked at him sideways. "Thomas used to say I was too proud for my own good. Guess dying didn't cure him of being right." "Pride's not always bad," Caleb said. "Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us standing. And sometimes it keeps us from seeing what's right in front of us." She turned to face him fully. "I see you, Caleb Whitlock. I see what you've given up for me, and I won't forget it." "I didn't do it for gratitude." "I know." Her voice was soft. "That's why it matters." As if in response to their words, the evening sky rumbled with distant thunder. Not a dust storm this time, but the promise of something rarer and more precious rain. They stood together watching clouds build on the horizon, dark and heavy with possibility. "Might just be a tease," Evie warned, but her voice held hope. "Might be," Caleb agreed. "But sometimes the universe surprises us." The first drops fell as they headed inside, fat and warm and smelling of life. By the time they reached the porch, it was pouring, the kind of drenching rain that could save dying land and dying dreams. They stood under the small overhang, watching the water run in rivulets across the parched earth, washing away dust and despair alike. "It's not enough to solve everything," Evie said, holding her hand out to catch the drops. "But it's a start." "Most things worth doing start small," Caleb replied, watching her smile as the rain soaked her outstretched fingers. "The rest is just staying power." Thunder rolled across the plains, and lightning illuminated the ranch in brief. Brilliant flashes. In those moments of stark clarity, they could see both what had been lost and what might yet be saved. The storm that had seemed like an ending was becoming something else, a washing clean, a chance to begin again. "Tomorrow we register that bull's offspring in town," Evie said with sudden determination. "Make it official. And we file papers on every single boundary marker. Get the sheriff to witness them. If they want to fight, we'll give them one they can't win in the shadows." "Together?" Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. "Together." The summons came at dawn, delivered by one of Ephraim Whitlock's men who wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes. The message was brief: appear at the Triple W immediately, or consider himself no longer a son of the house. Caleb read it twice, then tucked it into his shirt pocket with steady hands. "You should go," Evie said quietly, watching from the doorway. "He's still your father." "That he is." Caleb checked his gun, a gesture born more of habit than real expectation of violence. "But I'm not the son he thinks he raised anymore." The ride to the Triple W took an hour, each familiar landmark a reminder of the life he was choosing to leave behind. The big house rose from the prairie like a monument to will and ambition, its windows reflecting the morning sun like accusing eyes. Ephraim waited in his study, the room that had witnessed every important decision in Caleb's life. "Sit," his father commanded, but Caleb remained standing. Ephraim studied his son with eyes cold as winter steel. You've embarrassed me. More than that, you've betrayed everything this family has built. For what a widow who'll lose that land anyway. For doing what's right, Caleb replied evenly. Something you taught me, once upon a time. Right, Ephraim laughed bitterly. Boy, right is what puts food on tables and roofs over heads. That Hart woman is sitting on water we need. The whole southern range depends on access to Clear Hollow. Then buy it fair, make an honest offer. I did. Her fool husband turned it down, and now she's following his stubborn path straight to ruin. Ephraim leaned back in his chair. But I'm going to make this simple. Cut ties with her now. Come back where you belong, and I'll make sure she gets a fair price for the land. Enough to start over somewhere else. Comfortable like. And if I don't? The older man's face hardened. Then you're no son of mine. You'll get nothing, no inheritance, no protection, no name. You'll be just another hired hand scraping by on pride and poor decisions. Caleb felt the words hit like physical blows, but he'd expected them. If that's what it costs to look myself in the mirror, so be it. He turned to leave, but his father's voice stopped him at the door. She's bewitched you, boy. When this ends badly and it will don't come crawling back. Caleb left without another word. But the ride back to Evie's ranch felt longer than the journey out. He'd just cut himself off from everything he'd ever known, everything he'd been raised to expect. Yet, as the small buildings came into view, smoke rising from the chimney in a welcoming spiral, he felt lighter than he had in years. Evie was checking fence posts when Vince Cutter found her alone. Caleb had gone to check the far pasture, and she'd thought nothing of working by herself until she heard the approaching hoofbeats. Cutter swung down from his horse with the lazy confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. "Widow Hart," he drawled, keeping his hand casual near his gun. "Thought we should have a private talk, just you and me." "Nothing you have to say interests me." She kept working, though every nerve screamed danger. "Oh, I think it might." He moved closer. Close enough that she could smell the whiskey and tobacco on him. "See, your boy Caleb ain't here to play hero. His daddy's cut him off, which means you've got no protection anymore. But I could be real friendly to a woman who was smart enough to be friendly back." The implications in his voice made her skin crawl. She gripped the fence tool tighter, calculating distances and options. "Get off my land." Now, is that any way to talk to someone offering help? He reached out as if to touch her face. The crack of knuckles against jaw was loud in the morning air. Cutter stumbled back, blood streaming from his nose, to find Caleb standing between him and Evie. "Touch her again, and I'll kill you," Caleb said quietly. And something in his voice made it clear this wasn't a threat, but a simple statement of fact. Cutter wiped blood from his face, eyes blazing. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Boy, both of you." He mounted his horse with wounded dignity. "This ain't over, not by a long shot." After he rode off, Evie realized she was shaking. "How did you—" "Saw him heading this way, cut across the creek." Caleb flexed his hand, knuckles already swelling. "You all right?" "Yes." She took a breath, steadying herself. "Your father made his position clear. I made mine clearer." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "I'm just a hired hand now. Evie, no name to protect you, no influence to wield. If you want me to leave—" "Don't!" The word came out sharper than she intended. "Don't you dare leave now!" That night, the dust storm hit with a vengeance. The sky turned yellow as sulfur, and the wind howled like all the demons of hell had been loosed on the plains. They worked frantically to secure everything they could, tools, equipment, anything that might blow away. The animals huddled together, eyes white with fear. Inside the house, the walls groaned and shutters banged despite being latched tight. Dust seeped through every crack, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. They sat at the kitchen table, bandanas tied over their faces, listening to the world try to tear itself apart outside. Had a storm like this the year Thomas and I were married, Evie said, voice muffled by the cloth. Thought it was the end of the world. He just held my hand and said, "If it is, at least we're together." I thought he was being romantic. Now I think he was just being practical. Caleb reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, she took his hand. They sat like that while the storm raged, drawing comfort from simple human connection in the face of nature's fury. Dawn revealed the devastation. 2 cattle dead, suffocated by dust. The chicken coop demolished. Birds scattered to the winds. Fence posts down for a quarter mile. Evie stood surveying the damage, and for the first time since Thomas died, Caleb saw her shoulders shake with suppressed sobs. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. "We'll fix it all." "With what?" She turned on him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've got 3 weeks to pay the bank. I've lost stock, lost feed, lost time." "They win. Caleb, your father, Cutter, all of them. They win because they can afford to wait while I'm bled dry by acts of God and acts of men." He pulled her against him then, and she let him, crying into his shirt while he held her. When the storm of tears passed, she pulled back, embarrassed by the show of weakness. "I'm sorry, Don't apologize for being human," he said gently. "Even the strongest people need to break sometimes." That afternoon, Caleb rode back to the Triple W while Evie salvaged what she could from the storm damage. He went not to the main house, but to the breeding barn, where the prize bull his father had bought last spring was kept. It was a magnificent animal, worth more than most men saw in a lifetime. Caleb studied it for a long moment, then made his decision. "I need to borrow Samson," he told the startled hand on duty. "Personal business." "But Mr. Whitlock said." "I'm still a Whitlock until he puts it in writing," Caleb said firmly. "Samson's partly mine by rights. I'll have him back in a week." He led the bull back to Evie's ranch, where she stood speechless at the sight. "Caleb! No, you can't." "Already done. Your cows need breeding to be worth anything at market. This fellow can service the whole herd in a few days, and the calves will bring triple price come spring." He avoided her eyes. "Call it an investment in the future. Your father will—" "My father's already done his worst. Let me do this, Evie. Let me help the only way I can now." That evening, as they watched the valuable bull get acquainted with the cows, Evie said quietly, "I've been a fool." "How's that?" "Thinking I had to do everything alone. Thinking accepting help meant being weak." She looked at him sideways. "Thomas used to say I was too proud for my own good. Guess dying didn't cure him of being right." "Pride's not always bad," Caleb said. "Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps us standing. And sometimes it keeps us from seeing what's right in front of us." She turned to face him fully. "I see you, Caleb Whitlock. I see what you've given up for me, and I won't forget it." "I didn't do it for gratitude." "I know." Her voice was soft. "That's why it matters." As if in response to their words, the evening sky rumbled with distant thunder. Not a dust storm this time, but the promise of something rarer and more precious rain. They stood together watching clouds build on the horizon, dark and heavy with possibility. "Might just be a tease," Evie warned, but her voice held hope. "Might be," Caleb agreed. "But sometimes the universe surprises us." The first drops fell as they headed inside, fat and warm and smelling of life. By the time they reached the porch, it was pouring, the kind of drenching rain that could save dying land and dying dreams. They stood under the small overhang, watching the water run in rivulets across the parched earth, washing away dust and despair alike. "It's not enough to solve everything," Evie said, holding her hand out to catch the drops. "But it's a start." "Most things worth doing start small," Caleb replied, watching her smile as the rain soaked her outstretched fingers. "The rest is just staying power." Thunder rolled across the plains, and lightning illuminated the ranch in brief, brilliant flashes, In those moments of stark clarity, they could see both what had been lost and what might yet be saved. The storm that had seemed like an ending was becoming something else, a washing clean, a chance to begin again. "Tomorrow we register that bull's offspring in town," Evie said with a sudden determination. "Make it official, and we file papers on every single boundary marker. Get the sheriff to witness them. If they want to fight, we'll give them one they can't win in the shadows." "Together?" Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer. "Together." The legal assault began with papers served at dawn. Lyle Caro himself rode out from the bank, accompanied by a surveyor named Silas Dodd, whose reputation was as crooked as a dog's hind leg. They presented documents claiming the boundary markers had been erroneously placed during Thomas Hart's time, suggesting the access to Clear Hollow actually lay outside Evie's property line. "This is preposterous," Evie said, scanning the papers while standing on her porch. "These boundaries were set by government surveyors 10 years ago." Dodd, a thin man with nervous hands, produced a new map. "Mistakes happen. Mrs. Whitlock. My measurements show the original markers were placed 300 yards off. The creek access belongs to the Triple W." "How convenient," Caleb said dryly, appearing from the barn. "And how much did my father pay for this new geography?" Caro's face flushed. "That's a serious accusation. Young man, we're simply correcting a historical error." Evie retreated inside, returning with a worn leather journal. Thomas's handwriting sprawled across pages yellowed with age dates, measurements, and most importantly, the names of the 2 federal surveyors who'd set the original boundaries. "Jacob Mills and David Thornton," she read aloud. "Federal employees. Both. Their measurements were witnessed by 6 local ranchers. You're saying all of them were wrong? Records can be mistaken," Dodd muttered, not meeting her eyes. That afternoon, Sheriff Deke Harmon rode out to investigate reports of disturbance near the boundary markers. He found fresh excavation marks around the stone markers, clear evidence someone had been digging. The hoofprints nearby bore the distinctive mark of shoes used by the Triple W, a custom design Ephraim had commissioned from the blacksmith. "Someone's been tampering with federal markers," Harmon told Evie and Caleb. "That's a serious crime. If I can prove who did it—" "We all know who did it," Evie said bitterly. "Proving it is another matter. The sheriff, a decent man caught between law and politics, sighed heavily. "I'll document everything, take measurements myself. But this is heading for court, and judges can be influenced." That night brought the cold snap locals called a blue norther, temperature dropping 40 degrees in an hour. In the bitter darkness, wolves pressed close to the weakened barn, drawn by hunger and the scent of vulnerable livestock. Evie woke to Juniper's terrified whinnying and grabbed her rifle. The lead wolf was already halfway through a gap in the damaged wall when she fired. The shot took it clean, dropping it instantly. But the pack scattered into the darkness. Caleb burst from the barn, his own weapon ready, and together they stood guard while the cattle milled in panic. "We can't defend everywhere at once," he said, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "They're wearing us down, piece by piece." "Then we stop defending," Evie replied, checking her ammunition. "Tomorrow, we go to court." The courthouse in town was a modest building that smelled of old paper and ambition. Judge Avery Pike, brought in from the county seat, was known for his fairness, which in these parts meant he couldn't be bought cheap. The courtroom filled quickly with spectators eager for drama. Ephraim's lawyer, a slick man named Garrison from Dallas, presented his case with theatrical flair. Maps were produced, experts testified, and throughout it all, Silas Dodd sweated through his testimony about corrected measurements. When Evie's turn came, she spoke simply and directly. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the law to be upheld. My husband and I filed proper claims, paid our taxes, and improved the land. Now, because someone wants our water access, We're supposed to believe surveyors were wrong by exactly the amount needed to steal it. Caleb testified next, his words carrying weight despite or perhaps because of his position as Ephraim's son. I've seen the original markers, Your Honor. I've also seen evidence of recent tampering. Someone's trying to rewrite history for profit. The surprise witness was Reverend Elkins, red-faced and clearly wrestling with his conscience. He stood before the court. I need to speak to something I overheard, he began, voice shaking. Last week, after the wedding, I was in McCready's saloon. Vince Cutter was drinking, boasting about how he'd moved the markers on orders from higher up. Said it was easier than burning them out. The courtroom erupted. Garrison objected furiously while Ephraim's face went stone cold. Judge Pike gavelled for order, then called a recess to consider the evidence. In the hallway, Ephraim cornered his son. You've chosen your side, boy. Now live with it. I have. Caleb replied steadily. Question is, can you... When court resumed, Judge Pike delivered his interim ruling. While this matter requires further investigation, I'm issuing a temporary injunction. The boundaries remain as originally surveyed until proven otherwise. Any interference with water access will be considered criminal trespass. He fixed Dodd with a stern glare. Mr. Dodd, you'll remain in town while we investigate possible fraud and tampering with federal markers. It was a victory, but a tenuous one. As they left the courthouse, Evie knew the fight was far from over. The law might be temporarily on their side, but law and justice weren't always the same thing in ranch country. They'll come at us another way now, Caleb warned as they rode home. Let them come, Evie said, exhaustion making her reckless. I'm tired of being afraid. The next days brought an unexpected respite. Word of the court proceedings had spread, and public opinion began to shift. Some remembered their own struggles against larger ranchers, their own fights for water and survival. Women who'd shunned Evie began to nod when they passed. A few even left baskets of food on her porch, no notes, no acknowledgement needed, just quiet support for someone making a stand. Mei Chen was more direct, arriving with her portable forge. Figured you could use some proper locks, she said, setting to work without waiting for permission, and maybe some reinforced hinges while I'm at it. The Ruiz family, who ran a small spread to the south, sent their eldest boy with an offer. Papa says if you need hands for the roundup, we'll trade work. Our well's running low too. Maybe it's time us small ranchers stuck together. But the peace was shattered when Caleb found the prize bull. Samson, dead in the north pasture. The animal hadn't been shot, that would have been too obvious. Instead, someone had fed it moldy grain laced with something toxic. A fortune in breeding potential, destroyed overnight. Evie found Caleb standing over the massive corpse. Fists clenched so tight his knuckles showed white. That bull was the future, he said quietly. Every calf he might have sired, every chance to improve the herd gone. We'll find another way, she said, though her heart sank at the loss. No. His voice was flat, dangerous. No more finding ways around their obstacles. It's time we set some of our own. That night, they made plans by lamplight. Not for defense or legal maneuvering, but for something more direct. If the rules of civilized society could be bent by those with power, then perhaps it was time to bend a few rules of their own. The Ruiz family and others like them, Evie said, tracing water routes on an old map. If we could create a water cooperative, share access and defense, it would be harder to pick us off one by one. And if we document every brand, every head of cattle, make it public record, Caleb added. It becomes harder for stock to mysteriously disappear. They worked until dawn, planning not just survival, but resistance. Outside, storm clouds gathered again, promising more rain, but this time, the approaching storm felt like an ally rather than another trial to endure. You know they'll call us troublemakers, Evie said as the first drops began to fall. Say we're stirring up discord. Good, Caleb replied, watching lightning fork across the sky. About time someone caused the right kind of trouble. As thunder rolled across the plains, they sealed their plans with coffee and determination. The widow and the disowned son, bound by necessity and growing respect, preparing to show the county what happened when power pushed too hard against those with nothing left to lose. The rain that had saved their cattle would water new seeds of rebellion, and in the rich soil of injustice, those seeds would grow wild and strong, like everything else that survived in this unforgiving land. Ephraim's rage manifested in silence more terrible than shouting. When Caleb arrived at the Triple W to collect his personal belongings, he found them already packed and waiting on the porch. Ranch hands he'd known since childhood wouldn't meet his eyes, and the foreman simply handed him the boxes without a word. "Tell my father I came for what's mine," Caleb said quietly. "He says you already took more than that," the foreman replied, then softened slightly. "Good luck, boy. You'll need it." Back at Evie's ranch, their ranch now, he supposed Caleb unpacked in the barn he'd made his home. Among his few possessions was a photograph of his mother, dead these 15 years. She'd been strong too, in her way, before the land and Ephraim's ambitions had worn her down to nothing. Evie appeared in the doorway with coffee and a proposition. "We need to establish boundaries," she said carefully. "This marriage, it was forced on both of us. I won't hold you to vows made at gunpoint." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying when this settles, when the land is secure and the debts are managed, you're free to go. We can have the marriage annulled. Claim coercion. No court would argue after what happened." Caleb studied her face, seeing the walls she'd built to protect herself. "And if I don't want to go, then we take it day by day. But I need you to know you have a choice. We both do, despite what they tried to take from us." They shook hands on it, a business arrangement between equals. But something in the touch lingered, a warmth neither quite expected. The next morning brought a new kind of battle. They rode to the courthouse and filed papers establishing Hart Ranch, Clear Hollow as the official name, pointedly removing Whitlock from any claim. Evie signed with her full name Evelyn Hart Whitlock, but made it clear which name held her loyalty. Word of their water cooperative spread through the smaller ranches. The first meeting took place in Evie's kitchen. 6 families crowded around her table, mapping out a system of shared access and mutual defense. Old Miguel Ruiz, weathered by 70 years of Texas sun, became an unexpected ally. "My grandfather fought the Comanche for this land," he said in accented English. "My father fought drought and locusts. Now we fight different enemies, men who use paper instead of bullets. But the principle remains. We stand together or fall separately." Mei Chen offered her blacksmith skills for repair work. The Hendricks family, struggling with their own water issues, pledged labor for maintenance. Even Dr. Samuel Hill, who'd quietly tended the poor despite social pressure, offered medical services in trade. "You're building something dangerous," he warned Evie privately. "Ephraim Whitlock doesn't like competition, and he likes organized opposition even less." "Then he should have thought of that before he forced this fight," she replied. The counterstrike came swift and vicious. Vince Cutter led raids on cooperative members, cut fences, scattered cattle, poisoned water holes, always at night, always deniable. Sheriff Harmon did what he could, but without witnesses. His hands were tied. Then came the night they tried for Evie directly. She'd been checking on a sick calf when she heard Juniper's warning whinny. 3 riders approached through the darkness, moving with predatory purpose. Evie slipped behind the water trough, rifle ready, heart pounding. The first shot shattered the window behind where she'd been standing. She returned fire, aiming high, trying to drive them off without killing. In the chaos of gunfire and shouting, she didn't see the 4th rider circling behind until Caleb's warning shout cut through the night. He'd been in the far pasture but rode hard at the first shot. Now he came thundering in, firing from horseback, scattering the attackers. One rider fell from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The others grabbed him and fled, leaving blood on the ground and cursing in the air. "You hit?" Caleb asked, sliding from his horse. "No, but they weren't trying to miss this time." They found Cutter's distinctive spur rowel in the dirt, evidence enough to take to the sheriff. By morning, Harmon had arrested him for attempted murder. The wounded man, seeking leniency, confirmed Cutter had been hired to solve the heart problem permanently. The trial was swift. Cutter, faced with hanging, broke completely. In a courtroom packed to capacity, he testified about Ephraim's orders, the payments, the campaign of terror designed to drive out small ranchers and consolidate water rights. "He never said kill her outright," Cutter wheezed from the witness stand. "Just make the problem go away." We all knew what that meant. Ephraim sat stone-faced through the testimony, his lawyer objecting futilely. When the verdict came down guilty, 10 years hard labor, something shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. The untouchable had been touched. The powerful had been held accountable. That night, the rains came in earnest. Not the violent storms of before, but steady, soaking rain that lasted 3 days. The earth drank deeply, cracks healing, grass beginning to green. At Clear Hollow, the water rose to levels not seen in years. Evie stood in the rain, letting it wash away months of dust and fear. Caleb found her there, laughing and crying simultaneously.
"We did it!"
she said, voice wondering. "We actually did it. The legal fight's won," he agreed. "But this isn't over. My father doesn't accept defeat easily." As if to prove his point, a lone rider approached through the rain. They tensed, but it was only Reverend Elkins, hunched miserable under an oilcloth. "I came to apologize," he said without preamble. "I let myself be used. Let fear of the powerful override what I knew was right. I'm resigning my position, moving on. But first, I needed to say what they made you do. That travesty of a wedding. It wasn't godly. If you want, I'll testify to the coercion, help you get it annulled." Evie exchanged glances with Caleb. "Thank you, Reverend. We'll consider it." After he left, they stood together in the kitchen, rain drumming on the roof. The offer of annulment lay between them like a door suddenly opened. "He's right," Evie said quietly. "What happened in that feed store wasn't a marriage. It was a business transaction conducted under duress. Is that what you want, an annulment?" She was quiet for a long moment, watching steam rise from her coffee cup. "2 months ago, yes, without question. Now," she looked up at him. "Now I don't know. You've stood by me when you had every reason to walk away. That means something." "It means we make a good team," Caleb said carefully. "Is that all we are, a team?" The question hung in the air. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains, but inside, the silence was complete. Finally, Caleb reached across the table, taking her hand. "That first night, when I stopped to fix your wagon, I told myself I was just being neighborly. But the truth is, I'd been watching you for years. The way you never backed down, never gave in, never let this hard country break you. You were everything I wanted to be but didn't have the courage for." Evie turned her hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. "And now I know you're not just strong. You're kind, too fair. You fight for what's right, not just what's yours." He squeezed gently. "If you want to end this marriage, I'll sign whatever papers you put in front of me. But if you're willing to really try to make something real from what started false—" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'm willing to try." The first real kiss of their marriage happened there, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and rain, with calloused hands clasped and hearts finally open. It wasn't the stuff of romance novels. They were both too scarred, too practical for that. But it was honest, and in this hard country, honesty was worth more than gold. Later, as they planned the autumn roundup and discussed expanding the cooperative, Evie said, "We should have a real wedding, something we choose, with words we mean." After the spring calving, Caleb agreed. When the ranch is profitable again and we can invite who we want, not who we're forced to tolerate. That night, for the first time, they didn't retreat to separate quarters. Nothing improper happened. They were still finding their way from partnership to something deeper. But Caleb held her as she slept, and Evie woke feeling safer than she had since Thomas died. The morning brought news from town. Ephraim had withdrawn his objection to the water cooperative, formally recognizing the Hart Ranch boundaries. It wasn't reconciliation that might never come, but it was acknowledgement of defeat. And from a man like Ephraim Whitlock, that was victory enough. "He'll come to the wedding," Caleb predicted. Not out of love, but because appearances matter to him. He'll play the gracious father and hate every minute of it. "Let him come," Evie said, surprising herself by meaning it. "Every person there will know the truth that we chose each other freely, despite him, not because of him." As the sun broke through the dissipating clouds, painting the rain-washed land in shades of gold and green, they stood together on their porch, the ranch spread before them battered but unbroken, like its owners. The real work was just beginning, rebuilding what had been damaged, growing what had been planted, nurturing what had taken root between them. "No more looking back," Evie declared. "From here on, we build forward. Together." Caleb agreed, and the word that had once been a desperate alliance now held the promise of something much deeper. The land was still hard, the work still demanding, the future still uncertain, but they faced it as partners in truth now, bound not by coercion, but by choice. And in the wild heart of Texas, choice was the most precious freedom of all. The conversation came in the quiet hour before dawn, when the world held its breath between night and day. Evie sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee, finding words for feelings she'd kept locked away. "The day they forced us to marry," she began, voice steady but soft. "Something in me died. The part that believed I had control over my own life, my own choices. I felt like a horse being broken, and I swore I'd never forgive any of them for it." Caleb listened from across the table, giving her the space to speak truths too long buried. "But these past weeks, working beside you, fighting together," she looked up, meeting his eyes. "I've learned something. They may have forced us together, but they can't force what we've built from it. That's ours alone." "The first time I stood up to my father was the day I met you," Caleb admitted. "Really met you, not just saw you in town. You were standing there with a broken wagon and pride strong enough to move mountains. And I thought, there's someone who knows who they are. I'd spent my whole life being shaped by his expectations, and you made me want to find my own shape. And now I know that choosing right over easy isn't a single moment. It's 100 small choices every day. Each one I've made beside you has taught me more about the man I want to be than 28 years of following orders ever did." They sat with these truths between them, fragile as new growth but deep-rooted. When Evie spoke again, her voice carried decision. "I want a real wedding. Not to erase what happened, that's part of our story now, ugly as it is, but to choose you properly, in front of witnesses who matter to us, with words that mean something." "Clear Hollow," Caleb said immediately. "Where we first knew we could trust each other. Where the water runs clean and the cottonwoods give shade." "Yes," she smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to beautiful. "And we'll invite who we please, serve what food we can afford, and dance if we want to. No guns, no threats, no negotiations, just us." They began planning that morning, scratching out lists on the back of feed store receipts, the Ruiz family. Of course, May Chen and her quiet husband, Doctor, Hill and his wife, the other small ranchers who joined the water cooperative, people who'd stood by them when it cost something to do so. The work of rebuilding continued around their planning. The barn rose from its ashes, stronger than before. New fence posts went in, straight and deep. The garden Evie had let go to seed during the worst of the troubles began to show green shoots of recovery. It was while setting posts for a new corral that Ephraim Whitlock arrived. He came alone, driving a modest wagon instead of his usual impressive carriage. At 60, he looked older, worn down by the weight of his own choices. Caleb straightened but didn't stop working. "Father!" "Son." Ephraim climbed down carefully, his movements showing his age. "Mrs. Whitlock."
Mr. Whitlock,
Evie replied,
neutral as Switzerland.
They stood in awkward silence until Ephraim cleared his throat.
"I came to settle some things. First, this."
He pulled out a leather folder, extracting documents. "Deed transfer for the 50 acres along your northern border, the land that buffers between our properties. It's yours now, both of yours." Caleb set down his post-hole digger. "Why?" "Because I built my empire on taking what I wanted, and somewhere along the way, I forgot that empires built on theft crumble from within." He looked old, tired. "Your mother tried to tell me that. You're telling me now. Maybe it's time I listened." Evie studied the papers carefully. She'd learned to read every word of legal documents. They were legitimate, already filed with the county.
"This is generous,"
she said carefully.
"but forgiveness isn't bought with land."
"I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for possibility. The chance that someday my son might bring his children to visit their grandfather without hate in their hearts." "Children are a long way off," Caleb said quietly, "and trust takes time to rebuild." "I have time," Ephraim replied, "and I'd like to attend your wedding, your real one, not as patriarch or power broker, but as a father who made mistakes and wants to do better." Evie and Caleb exchanged glances, communicating in the wordless way of partners who'd faced fire together.
"You can come,"
Evie said finally.
"but you come as a guest."
"Nothing more, no speeches, no attempts to control anything. You witness our choice and respect it, or you don't come at all." "Agreed." Ephraim reached into the wagon, pulling out something wrapped in oilcloth. "This was Elizabeth Caleb's mother. She'd want you to have it." Inside was a wedding ring, simple gold with tiny garnets. Caleb's breath caught. "She wore this every day." "Every day until she died," said it reminded her that some choices, once made with a true heart, are worth keeping. He climbed back onto the wagon. "I'll see you at the wedding." After he left, Caleb stood holding his mother's ring, memory and possibility circling in gold. "I never thought he'd bend. Even stone erodes with enough water," Evie said. "Question is whether we let him close enough to prove the change is real." "One step at a time," Caleb decided. "Same as everything else." The night before their chosen wedding day, Evie wrote a letter to Thomas. She'd done it before, in the darkest times, but this one was different. "I kept my promise," she wrote. "I held the land, fought for what we built, but I've learned something you always knew: land is just dirt without people to share it with. I'm choosing to love again, not to replace you, but to honor what you taught me about the value of partnership. Be at peace, knowing I am too." She burned the letter at Clear Hollow, watching smoke carry her words skyward. Caleb stood beside her, understanding the ritual of goodbye that allowed for new hellos. The wedding morning dawned clear and warm. No dust storms, no drama, just nature in a cooperative mood. The spot by Clear Hollow had been transformed with simple touches: wildflowers in mason jars, ribbons tied to cottonwood branches, planks laid for dancing. Evie wore her mother's dress, altered to fit and dyed a soft blue. Caleb wore his best shirt and a new vest Mei Chen's husband had sewn. They looked like what they were: ranch people cleaned up for a special occasion. Nothing fancy, but everything real. The guests assembled without fanfare, small ranchers and their families, people who understood that water and trust were the two most precious resources in this hard country. Ephraim stood to one side, keeping his promise to remain just another witness. Reverend Elkins had been replaced by Circuit Judge Morrison, a woman who'd fought her own battles for respect in a man's profession. Her words were simple and direct.
"Marriage is a choice," she began. "Not just made once, but made daily. These two have already proven they choose each other in hardship. Now they choose each other in hope."
The vows were their own. Evie spoke first. "I promise to stand beside you in drought and plenty, in conflict and peace. I promise to see you not as my rescue or my burden, but as my partner in all things. I choose you, Caleb Whitlock, freely and fully." Caleb's voice was steady. "I promise to respect your strength while offering mine, to build alongside you, not over you, to remember that the best things grow wild and can't be forced. I choose you, Evelyn Hart, today and all days." When they kissed, it was to cheers and a few tears. Lucy Ruiz, the orphan girl from the neighboring ranch, ran forward to tie a blue ribbon on Juniper's mane, her gap-toothed grin bright as sunshine. The celebration was modest but joyful. Barbecued beef from their own herd, cornbread and beans, pies from every kitchen in the cooperative. Musicians played under the cottonwoods, and dancing broke out as the sun moved toward evening.
"Look at them,"
May Chen said to her husband, watching Evie and Caleb dance.
"Who'd have thought something good could come from such a hard beginning?"
"Steel's forged in fire," he replied. "Sometimes the best things are—" As darkness fell and guests began departing, Ephraim approached his son and daughter-in-law. "Thank you for allowing me to witness this," he said formally. Then, more quietly,
"Your mother would have loved her. Caleb loved both of you. Maybe you'll tell me about her sometime,"
Evie offered.
"The real her, not the perfect memory."
Ephraim's eyes widened slightly at the olive branch. "I'd like that. Maybe Sunday dinner. Once a month to start." "We'll see," Caleb said, but his tone held possibility. When everyone had gone and they stood alone by the water, Evie laughed suddenly.
"Do you realize we just got married again properly this time?"
"I was there," Caleb said dryly.
"Seemed to go better without the guns." "Everything does."
She leaned against him, watching stars reflect in the water.
"Thank you."
"For what?"
"For seeing me as myself, not as someone to be saved or owned. For choosing to stay when you could have run. For being the kind of man who gets stronger by admitting he was wrong.
Thank you for teaching me how," he replied simply. They rode home under a canopy of stars, the ranch building's dark shapes against the horizon. But this time, riding toward that small collection of structures felt like coming home to possibility rather than prison. Inside, Caleb lit the lamps while Evie put coffee on out of habit. They moved around each other with easy familiarity, the kitchen that had seen so much conflict now holding peace.
"So, Mrs. Whitlock,"
Caleb said with a slight smile. "What comes next?"
"Tomorrow we start planning for winter feed.
Next week we help the Hendricks family dig their new well. Next month we see if your father can make it through dinner without trying to run everything." She smiled back.
"The same things that always come next: work,
weather, and finding our way. Only now we do it together by choice."
"I like the sound of that,"
he said, pulling her close. Outside, a coyote called across the distance, answered by another. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying the scent of rain. The land remained unforgiving, demanding, real. But inside the small ranch house, two people who'd found their way from coercion to choice, from survival to love, faced whatever came next as true partners. The shotgun wedding had failed to break them. Instead, like everything else in this hard country that survived against the odds, it had made them stronger. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all, not over Ephraim or Cutter or drought, but over the circumstances that had tried to define them. They defined themselves now, and that made all the difference. Spring arrived with the vigor of new life across the plains. The longhorn herd,
strengthened by winter feeding and careful management, showed the results of Evie's meticulous record-keeping and Caleb's experienced handling. New calves dotted the pastures, their bloodlines traced in Evie's neat handwriting in ledgers that would prove their worth at market. The ranch books, once a source of dread, now showed promise. Each column of figures represented progress debts steadily reduced, income slowly increasing, the future becoming something to plan for rather than fear. Evie worked the numbers while Caleb negotiated with buyers, and together they found a rhythm that turned survival into success. Henderson from the Fort Worth outfit wants to contract for 30 head. Caleb reported one evening, dust still on his clothes from the long ride to town. Fair price, honest weights. No under-the-table dealing. That'll clear the banknote and leave enough for improvements. Evie calculated quickly. We could finally fix the main house roof properly. Maybe even start that second well we discussed. The water cooperative had grown from desperate alliance to thriving community. What started as 6 families now numbered 15, with shared resources and mutual protection that made them all stronger. The monthly meetings rotated between ranches, each family contributing what they could: food, labor, knowledge. It was at one such meeting that they received word of the court's final decision. Lyle Caro had been stripped of his position at the bank, his fraudulent dealings exposed. Silas Dodd faced 2 years in prison for tampering with federal markers. Vince Cutter was already serving his sentence, his testimony having unraveled a web of corruption that reached into several counties. Justice tastes sweeter when it's aged properly, old Miguel Ruiz observed, raising his coffee cup in a toast. But it was Ephraim's transformation that surprised everyone most. His monthly dinners at the ranch had evolved from stilted affairs to genuine family gatherings. He spoke of Caleb's mother more freely now, sharing stories that helped his son understand both parents better. She loved thunderstorms. He told them one evening, watching lightning dance across the horizon. Said they reminded her that power isn't always about control, sometimes it's about letting go. Took you long enough to learn that lesson, Evie said gently, softening the words with a small smile. Too long, Ephraim agreed. But better late than too late. The changes in the community reflected larger shifts happening across the territory. The railroad pushed closer, bringing new markets and opportunities. Some of the old guard resisted, clinging to the ways that had made them powerful. Others, like Ephraim, adapted, finding that cooperation could be more profitable than domination. Mei Chen expanded her blacksmith shop, training apprentices from among the ranchers' children. Dr. Hill established a clinic that served all families regardless of ability to pay, funded partly by the cooperative's emergency fund. The schoolhouse, long neglected, got new books and a teacher who believed education belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy. It was into this changing world that Evie discovered she was pregnant. The knowledge came quietly, confirmed by Dr. Hill on a morning when wildflowers painted the prairie in purple and gold. She sat with the information for a full day before telling Caleb, wanting to be sure of her own feelings first. "You're certain?" he asked when she told him, his hands stilling on the harness he was mending. "As certain as these things can be. Dr. Hill says late autumn." The joy on his face was tempered with concern. Is this what you want?" "I lost so much," she said slowly. "Thomas, my old life, control over my own choices for a while. But I've gained this ranch reborn, a community that stands together. A child feels like the next chapter of a story I'm finally ready to write." He crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair to place a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Our child will know both strength and kindness. Will learn that sometimes the hardest battles are worth fighting. And that sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning," Evie added, covering his hand with hers. The news brought unexpected visitors. Women who had once whispered about the improper widow now came with advice and baby clothes.
The water cooperative immediately began planning who would help with chores when Evie was confined, which families had cribs to loan, how to ensure the ranch kept running smoothly. Funny how a baby changes things. Mrs. Henderson observed, having driven out specially with a quilt her grandmother had made. Makes people remember we're all human, all just trying to make our way. But the warming relationships couldn't prevent all conflict. A group of riders from New Mexico, hard men following the outlaw trail, decided the small ranches looked like easy pickings. They started with the Hendricks place, stealing horses and threatening worse if anyone pursued. The response was swift and coordinated. Instead of each ranch defending alone, the cooperative activated its alert system. Church bells rang in patterns that meant trouble. Riders spread the word. And within hours, a posse had formed of ranchers, their hands, and even some townspeople who'd grown tired of lawlessness. Evie wanted to ride with them, but Caleb put his foot down for the first time in their marriage. "Not with our child to think of. Please," she conceded, but not passively. Instead, she coordinated from the ranch, organizing supplies, medical preparations, and communication between the scattered groups hunting the outlaws. When a rider came to steal from their ranch while the men were away, she met him with a shotgun and steady aim. "I'm pregnant, not helpless," she informed the would-be thief. "And if you think that makes me less dangerous, you're about to learn different." He took one look at her face and decided easier targets existed elsewhere. The outlaws were eventually cornered near the county line. Sheriff Harmon, backed by the United Ranchers, gave them a choice: surrender or face the combined fury of people who'd learned to protect their own. Faced with those odds, the outlaws chose wisdom over bravado. This is what they feared. Evie told Caleb that night as they celebrated the successful defense. "Not just you and me standing together, but all of us." Ephraim and ranchers like him built their power on keeping us separated, competing for scraps. Now we know we're stronger together. "Speaking of together," Caleb said with a grin, "I believe someone mentioned something about naming practices for our child." They spent the evening by the fire, tossing names back and forth like precious stones, examining each for flaws and beauty. Elizabeth for his mother, if a girl, perhaps. Thomas for her first husband, if a boy honoring the past while building the future. "Or something new entirely," Evie suggested. "A name with no history but what they make themselves." "Like us," Caleb agreed, pulling her close. The summer progressed with the usual challenges: a brief drought that tested their water management, a fever that swept through the cattle requiring careful quarantine, market prices that fluctuated with railroad politics. But each challenge was met with experience, resources, and most importantly, community support. Evie's pregnancy advanced like the seasons, inevitable and transforming. She adapted her work, finding ways to contribute that didn't risk the baby. Her ledgers became more detailed, her plans more long-term. She wrote contracts for next year's sales, established breeding records that would outlast them all, created systems that would endure. "You're nesting," Caleb teased, finding her reorganizing the supply closet for the third time. "I'm preparing," she corrected. "This child will inherit more than land. They'll inherit a legacy of fighting for what's right, of building community from conflict. I want everything in order for them." One evening, as purple dusk settled over the land, Ephraim made an unexpected proposal during their monthly dinner. "I've been thinking about the future," he began carefully. "The Triple W is too much for one man, and I have no illusions about living forever. I'd like to propose a partnership, not a takeover, not absorption, but true partnership, our ranches working together while remaining independent." Evie and Caleb exchanged looks. "Why?" Caleb asked simply. "Because I've learned that empires built on dominance die with their emperors, but legacies built on cooperation outlive us all." He looked at Evie's growing belly. "That child deserves better than the wars we fought. They deserve the peace we're building." "We'll think about it,"
Evie said diplomatically. Talk to the cooperative. See how it might work. No decisions made in isolation anymore.
Fair enough. Ephraim agreed. That's all I ask. As the evening wound down and Ephraim prepared to leave, he paused at the door. I was wrong about you. Evelyn, you're not just strong, you're wise. My son chose better than I ever did. After he left, Evie and Caleb sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance across the darkening prairie. The ranch spread before them no longer a desperate holding but a thriving concern. The scattered lights of other ranches dotted the distance, each representing allies rather than competitors. Strange how it all turned out, Evie mused, hand resting on her belly where new life grew. That forced marriage was meant to break me, claim my land, destroy my independence. Instead, it forged something stronger than anyone expected. Caleb finished. Including us. A coyote called in the distance, but it no longer sounded threatening, just another voice in the vast conversation of the plains. The wind carried the scent of rain and growing things, promise and fulfillment in equal measure. The story they'll tell about us, Evie said with a smile. About the shotgun wedding that sealed the widow's fate. They'll get it all wrong, won't they? Let them, Caleb replied, taking her hand. We know the truth, that fate isn't sealed by force but chosen by will. And we chose each other, chose this life, chose to build rather than break. As if in agreement, the baby kicked for the first time, strong and sure. Evie gasped, then laughed, guiding Caleb's hand to feel the movement. In that moment, past and future met in the promise of new life, and all the struggles that had brought them here seemed not like hardships but like necessary steps on the path to this quiet joy. The widow's fate had indeed been sealed not by guns or coercion, but by love freely chosen and fiercely defended. And that, they knew, made all the difference. A year had passed since the forced wedding that had meant to break them. Now, Hart Ranch, Clear Hollow, stood transformed, its wooden sign hanging straight and proud. The barn bright with new pine boards, fence lines running true across land that had drunk deep of good rains. The path worn between neighboring ranches spoke of connection rather than isolation. Evie stood at the kitchen window, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching the sunrise paint the grasslands gold. The baby would come soon, Doctor, Hill had said within the week. She felt ready in ways that had nothing to do with the carefully prepared cradle or the tiny clothes Mei Chen had helped her sew. This readiness went deeper, rooted in the knowledge that this child would be born into a community that had learned to stand together. The morning brought a letter from an unexpected source ranchers from 3 counties away, asking to learn about their water cooperative model. Word had spread of their success, how small ranchers had banded together to survive drought and opposition alike. Evie drafted a response, her handwriting careful and clear, outlining the simple principles they'd discovered: transparency, mutual aid, shared risk and reward. 3 rules, she wrote. Fair shares based on need, not greed. Clear records open to all members. Help given freely in hard times, knowing it will come back around when your own troubles find you. Caleb returned from checking the herds to find her sealing the letter. More converts to the cause. More people learning what we learned the hard way, that standing alone makes you easy to knock down. She smiled up at him. Though I wouldn't trade our hard way for an easier path. Not anymore. That evening brought rain. Steady and gentle, the kind that soaked deep without washing away topsoil. They sat on the porch, listening to it drum on the roof, watching it silver the grass. The sight of water falling freely from the sky never got old for people who'd known drought's bitter hand. I need to tell you something, Evie said quietly. I've been writing it all down. Our story, not the gossip version everyone thinks they know, but the truth of it. For our child, and maybe for others who need to know that forced beginnings don't have to mean broken endings. What do you call it? She smiled, a mix of irony and affection.
The title came from something Mrs. Burns said that day in the market, trying to shame us. The shotgun wedding sealed the widow's fate, only to bind her in love with the rancher's son. She meant it as condemnation. I'm claiming it as truth. Just not the truth she thought. 3 nights later, Evie woke to the familiar tightening that meant their child had chosen its time. Caleb rode hard for Dr. Hill while Mei Chen came to sit with her, the blacksmith's strong hands surprisingly gentle as she helped Evie through the early pains. First babies take their time, Mei said calmly. We'll see the sunrise before we see this little one. She was right. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, when their daughter entered the world with a cry that spoke of strength inherited from both parents. Evie held her, marveling at the perfect tiny fingers, the shock of dark hair, the fierce grip on life. Elizabeth, Caleb whispered, touching his daughter's cheek with one calloused finger. Elizabeth Hope Whitlock. Hope, Evie agreed, for all the obvious reasons. Ephraim arrived that afternoon, bearing an heirloom cradle and an expression of wonder that made him look younger than his years. May I? He asked, and at Evie's nod, held his granddaughter with careful reverence. She has your mother's eyes, he told Caleb softly, and something of Evie's chin. Stubborn stock on both sides, she'll need it in this country. She'll have more than stubbornness, Evie said firmly. She'll have community, teachers like May and Dr. Hill, neighbors who know how to stand together. A world where cooperation isn't weakness, but wisdom. The baby's arrival seemed to accelerate changes already in motion. The water cooperative formalized into a legal entity, with papers drawn up by a lawyer from Fort Worth who specialized in agricultural associations. What had begun as desperate alliance now stood as a model for others. Proof that small ranchers could thrive without becoming tyrants or victims. The spring gathering became an annual event. Rotating between member ranches, that first year at Hart Ranch, Clear Hollow, over 50 people came. Tables groaned under the weight of shared food. Children ran between the adults' legs, and music filled the evening air. Evie, carrying Elizabeth in a sling May's husband had woven, moved through the crowd with quiet pride. Look what you built, Doctor, Hill said, gesturing at the gathering. From tragedy and coercion, community. We built, Evie corrected. All of us choosing to be better than what tried to break us. During the gathering, old Miguel Ruiz stood to speak. A year ago, we were scattered, each fighting alone. Now look, our children play together. Our herds grow strong, our wells run deep. This is what they feared. Those who would control us, not our individual strength, but our united purpose. Applause met his words, but it was Ephraim who surprised everyone by standing next. I owe apologies to many here, he began, voice carrying across the crowd. I built my success on the old ways divide, conquer, control. My son and daughter-in-law taught me a harder lesson that true legacy isn't what you take but what you help grow. The Triple W stands ready to support this cooperative, not as leader but as member, if you'll have us. The vote was unanimous, though some grumbled good-naturedly about miracles and reformed sinners. But they voted yes because they'd learned that redemption, like rain, should be welcomed when it comes, regardless of past drought. That night, after guests had departed and Elizabeth slept in her cradle, Evie and Caleb walked to Clear Hollow. The creek ran strong and clear, cottonwoods rustling in the evening breeze. They stood where they'd first truly seen each other, where desperation had begun its transformation into partnership. Did you imagine this? Caleb asked. That day they forced us together. Could you see ahead to now? I saw survival, nothing more. I was so angry, so trapped. She laughed softly. If someone had told me I'd come to love you, to choose you freely, to build this life together, I'd have thought them mad. And now I know that the worst things that happen to us don't have to define us. They can refine us instead. If we choose it. She took his hand. Every morning, I choose you again. Choose this life we've built. Choose to see possibility where others saw only possession. They placed a new stone marker beside the creek, carved with simple words, heart, clear hollow, water, and community. Below, in smaller letters, from forced beginnings, chosen endings. As they walked back to the house, Elizabeth's cry carried on the wind. Evie quickened her pace, maternal instinct overriding everything else. But it was a cry of hunger, not distress, and soon solved with feeding while Caleb lit the lamps against gathering darkness. She'll never know what we knew, Evie said softly, watching their daughter nurse. The fear, the powerlessness, the forced choices. She'll know other challenges, Caleb replied. But she'll face them with advantages. We didn't have community support, established rights, parents who learned that fighting together beats fighting alone. A knock at the door interrupted them. Young Samuel Ruiz stood on the porch, hat in hand. Mrs. Whitlock, Mr. Whitlock, sorry to disturb, but there's riders coming from the east, strangers, asking about the water cooperative. Papa thought you should know. They exchanged glances. Even now, even with all they'd built, vigilance remained necessary. But this time, they wouldn't face whatever came alone. Within an hour, riders from 5 ranches had gathered, ready to meet these strangers with united purpose. The strangers turned out to be journalists from an eastern newspaper, come to write about the Wild West experiment in agricultural cooperation. They seemed amazed to find not the lawless frontier of their imagination, but a thriving community of small ranchers who'd learned that civilization meant more than individual power. But what about the romance of the lone rancher against the elements? One asked, clearly disappointed by the prosaic reality of cooperative success. Romance is for dime novels, Evie told him firmly. Reality is harder and better. We don't stand alone against the elements, we stand together, sharing strength and knowledge. That's how we survive. That's how we thrive. The journalists left with a story none of their readers would expect, not of gunfights and glory, but of water rights and community meetings, of forced marriages becoming real partnerships, of enemies becoming family through the radical act of choosing reconciliation over revenge. As autumn approached, bringing with it the anniversary of that forced wedding, Evie and Caleb prepared for their first harvest as a truly united ranch. The crops were strong, the cattle healthy, the water flowing clear and shared according to need. Elizabeth grew like the good grass after rain, strong and reaching for the sky. We should mark it, Caleb suggested one evening. The anniversary, not to celebrate what they did to us, but to remember how we transformed it. So on that day, instead of bitterness, they hosted a feast. Those who had stood in judgment came to eat at their table. The barn that had burned was now filled with neighbors' laughter. The creek that had been a point of conflict now watered herds owned by many families, all thriving together. As the sun set on that anniversary day, Evie stood to speak. They called it a shotgun wedding, meant to seal my fate. And they were right, it did seal my fate. It sealed my fate to stand with this man who chose right over easy. It sealed my fate to this community that chose cooperation over conquest. It sealed my fate to learn that love isn't just something that happens to us. It's something we choose, day by day, season by season. She raised her glass of clear water from Clear Hollow. To forced beginnings and chosen endings. To the family we're born into and the family we build. To the Wild West that's learning new ways without forgetting the strength of the old. To all of us, writing a different story than the one they thought they were telling. The toast echoed across the gathering. Voices joining in affirmation of a truth learned through hardship, that the strongest bonds are those tested by fire and chosen in freedom. That water shared is more valuable than water hoarded. That a woman's fate isn't sealed by others' choices, but by her own determination to transform forced circumstances into freely chosen life. As stars began to appear in the vast Texas sky, Evie looked out over the land, their land, in every sense that mattered. The widow's fate had indeed been sealed, but not in defeat. Instead, she'd found love with the rancher's son who'd learned to see her as an equal, a partner, a force of nature in her own right. Together, they'd written a story of redemption that no amount of force could have scripted. The West was still wild. Justice still required vigilance. Community still demanded work. But here at Hart Ranch, Clear Hollow, between the flowing water and the open sky, two people had built something worth more than all the cattle empires in Texas, a home where survival, justice, and love stood together, strong as stone markers beside clear water, enduring as the land itself. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale, whether you're listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while working on your own ranch. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Evie and Caleb's journey touched your heart? Let's connect and share our love for these frontier stories together.